Welcome to this episode of the Partovi Effect. My name is Mrs. Madi Partovi,
And I'm Dr. Ryan Partovi.
and our little one is 4 years old today.
Mhm. The big four.
We're having a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle themed birthday party for him. The 80s Teenage Mutant Ninja
Of
Turtle.
course, right? The only Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as far as I'm concerned.
He insisted that we have matching tattoos. So this is my The Shredder tattoo.
It's to be clear, it's the evil Shredder attacks tattoo.
It struck me that we just had an interview with a dialogue with Dr. Joel Warsh, and um, I asked him as a daddy Padawan, daddy Jedi, what he's committed to imparting to his
6-year-old.
Padawan son.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, and so I was being with that myself. And what is it that I'm committed to uh, imparting to my sons as a mother? And critical thinking is one, and the way that I work with our now 4-year-old or then 3-year-old on critical thinking is that I'll ask him to look at something, and I'll ask him, what is that? A puppy? Is that actually a puppy? No, it's a picture of a puppy. It's a drawing of a puppy. So he kind of starts thinking. And we were driving just the other day. I was driving. And then there was a snack, a special snack that he bought for himself, right?
I'm trying to wonder what this is.
Right.
So is it applesauce, dots?
There was those gluten-free crackers.
Oh, those gluten-free
Uh,
crackers that he loves.
yes.
They're grain-free, actually, but yeah.
And we were stopped at a stop sign, and then he asked me, Mommy, what are you doing? Driving? Mommy, what are you actually doing? Eating your crackers?
Oh, that's cute. I love it. I
It was
love it.
so stinking cute.
That checks
Just
out.
all of the 3-year-old, beautiful, lovely, magical things, that he says. Just he falls asleep with his hand on my cheek. And, he caresses my arm and then just puts his hand on my cheek and he falls asleep. And the other morning, I wake up to a hand on my cheek, and here he is right in front of my face. We're laying down side by side. And I look at him and he says, Mommy, you're so pretty. Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Just being presence to that I get to live. I get to love on little me. I get to provide a space.
I think that time it was little me. Just so we're clear.
He's very much little you, me, and him, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
providing the space for him as a mom to arise into his full self-expression and the beautiful things that he says and how he's so thoughtful and kind and funny. And I was brushing my teeth last night and he came up behind me and was patting me. He said, Mommy, you're hiding an instrument.
It is an instrument,
He
actually.
asks me
Now,
questions.
what it is, it's an instrument of is a whole nother topic, but it's definitely an instrument.
And he's just and we were sitting together and he's uh, looking at me. He says, Mommy, what are boobies for? And I asked him, what do you think they're for?
Mm.
Food?
Hmm. All right.
Oh, and my gosh, the child is just so brilliant. Um,
Hmm. So today's episode dedicated to him, our new 4-year-old.
yes, yes. he just says funny, such funny things sometimes. I'm taken aback by it, and I'm in awe by it. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. We have a 4-year-old.
We do.
I
He's doing great.
need my tissue again.
You need tissue. Do we have any around here? We can pause and I'll go grab some.
And I think he's just starting to really get that he goes to a different school than his brother because he keeps asking me sometimes, "Where's Ryan?" I said,
Hmm.
"Well, Ryan goes to a different school now, and you have one more year before you go to school together." And he got excited. He says, "One more year, and then I get to go to school with my sweet Ryan."
Yep.
The child is just very expressive, um, and he's loved, like fully self-expressed, you know?
Mhm.
So to be in the presence of that each day is a blessing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Got anything else on your mind today
I
other
do.
than
Well, you've illuminated just a tiny little bit of what you wanted to talk about today.
Mhm.
And sometimes when you do that, I'm like, huh? What is he? Why all the, you know? Um, and if you, I asked you, is it something that I should care about?
Hmm.
And I have a suspicion that maybe I should care about it for the sake of our sons.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that it's inside a broader cultural conversation on like what are the boundaries of acceptable conversation, right? And this has really been going on a lot lately. There's people on both sides of the political aisle talking a lot about it and sort of where those boundaries are and why those boundaries exist is kind of what this cuts to at the core. So just to give you a background, I would say that that is you know, are there any limits on what really, as Eric Weinstein says, what we mustn't talk about or what we mustn't say, because he has this distinction where he says, well, there's things that you legally can't say, there's things that you really shouldn't say, and there's things that we mustn't say. And, you know, mustn't is he kind of creates the distinction as like these are things which we um and I might mess this up, but basically it's the idea that he puts forward, and there's a recent Piers Morgan interview that he did where it's like there's certain things where that saying them, the consequences of saying them are, you know, not worth them being said. It's not that we should make them illegal. It's not that you can't say them, but more that really you mustn't. That saying them is does more harm than good. And that is an interesting concept because I kind of think of myself as being a free speech advocate who really is a big believer in free speech. Um, and then what's interesting in that interview, which I recommend to everyone, where Piers really pushes him, okay, well, give me some examples of people we've had on, and and so I can either agree with you or disagree, and because and he refuses to do that throughout the almost 45-minute interview because he basically says, if I name these people, they're going to come after me. So I'm not going to do it. But I'm describing them. And they're basically people who are going to come after you for your ideas, um, and or for pushing back on their ideas. But I think I have a way to help people identify those people. And it came out of a conversation that I heard Brett Weinstein, Eric's brother, who's the co-host of the Dark Horse podcast, which is, you know, my, I guess now second favorite podcast after ours, right? um, but has been my favorite for a long time, and with his wife Heather Hying, and a conversation he had recently with Jordan Peterson. So,
I'm left in
before I get into that, is there anything else you wanted to
I
say?
am left in full suspense because a lot of what you're saying is very conceptual. So I'm
Okay.
I'm kind of excited to get into
Well,
it.
this is a conceptual conversation on some level, but I would say it is an important concept that
Okay.
everybody needs to get. Because if you can really get this, it's going to help demystify a lot of the cultural conversation that's going on right now. Because our society is in the midst of a cultural transition, and we have to be really clear on where we want that to go. Do we want to, is it an out with the old, in with the new, and is that new really new, or is it actually the return of some kind of darker things from the past that maybe are best left in the past? And that's at the root of this conversation. Is like, what kind of future do we want to create for our lives and for our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives? And I think if you can root yourself in that, then I think you'll really be coming from a good place.
Great. Well, I intuitively rooted myself in that
Good.
moment. We have children.
Yeah. Great. Okay, great. So I'll get started. You know, I first I just want to say right off the bat, obviously I really respect Brett Weinstein. I really admire his courage and the way he insists on clarity and his drive to build better models of understanding. And so this model that I'm going to present is really in the same spirit, the same ethos that he presents all of his models of reality, because I think he got something wrong, or at least something that needs some sharpening, some refinement. Um, so he frames, and I'm going to play a clip from a recent podcast so you can hear it in his own words. But he frames multiculturalism as kind of a problem, a force that fractures society, and he pits it directly against cosmopolitanism, or what he calls Western cosmopolitanism, which he says this is the solution. But the issue is, I think that's a misdiagnosis, which is something that I have some expertise in, right? Diagnosis. I would argue the problem is not multiculturalism, the problem is identitarianism. And I think if we don't get that distinction right, we're going to misdiagnose the disease and then prescribe the wrong cure. So let's get precise, which is something that I know Brett uh, appreciates. And I'm going to start by giving him the opportunity to really state his case in his own words. Here we go. And I want to make sure that, oops. I don't know why.
I've come to the conclusion that we've been sold a bill of goods, and the bill of goods was called multiculturalism. And the problem with multiculturalism is that it sounds like something that those of us who like to interact with people from many different cultures should appreciate. But it's in fact the opposite of the value that we actually hold. The value that we actually hold, I would call Western cosmopolitanism.
Yeah,
Western
that's very different.
cosmopolitanism. It's the opposite, right? Multiculturalism is the idea that people should not join our societies, but they should maintain their own traditions in an isolated pocket, and that we should effectively reject the idea of becoming one people in the West.
It's just a reduplication of the situation that obtains in the world at large.
All right. So, I think that that's pretty clear what he said. Did you have any thoughts about that before I get into my thoughts about it?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, and of course, I encourage people to listen to that whole conversation. It's really great. It's right after he came back from the Darien Gap. And anyway, I've been thinking about this for the last few months since they recorded that podcast. And I think that, one of the things that Dr. Peterson often talks about is how most disagreements are definitional. So I think it's really important to get at the definition of some of these words before we can really say what's an opposite, what's not, right? And really discern what is at issue in our society right now. So, what I'm going to offer is the definition of cosmopolitan, which is at its core is the belief that every human being belongs to a single moral community. It's about universals, dignity, human rights, empathy. Cosmopolitan says you can be proud of where you're from, but not at the expense of someone else. So it's the idea that your tribe is humanity itself. And I think that Brett would probably agree with that definition. So cosmopolitanism is this vision of mutual respect, shared responsibility as a society, and you can be cosmopolitan and be on the left or the right. And well, I forgot we're mirroring the screen. I should have said, and the left. You can be on the left or the right. And so then that begs the question of what's multiculturalism? So multiculturalism in its classical liberal form, which is, the form that most of us grew up understanding, is just the idea that a healthy society can be composed of different people from different cultures, different traditions, different backgrounds, and we should make room at the table for those differences and make room for those different voices. And so it's about coexistence. It's not about supremacy of any one particular, any one background, any one culture, any one tradition. So it's, the idea that all cultures are respected. So what I think when Brett is critiquing multiculturalism, I think what he's really pushing back on is not multiculturalism itself, but a corrupted, kind of a corruption of it, which is one that has been hijacked by identitarian leftism. But that is not multiculturalism. It's actually something else entirely, is what I'm going to make the case for. So identitarianism. So this is what actually I think he's seeing. So identitarianism says that your identity group, whether defined by race, religion, sexuality, nationality, is the most important thing about you. That your group's historical grievances or superiority give you special moral status. That we need to organize society around group identity versus individual rights, which is what we've historically done. So this idea shows up on both sides of the political spectrum. On the right, you see it as white nationalism, you see it as Christian nationalism, you see it as ethno-traditionalism. So the idea that, we need to have states organized around ethnic groups, right? Tribes, essentially. On the left, you see the same kind of tribalism, but it manifests as intersectionality as doctrine, the idea that, well, someone who's had a stronger history of oppression needs to be given more of a voice and have more rights than someone who has less of it. So basically, if you're, a Black lesbian, who's only has one leg, your voice should be listened to more than someone who is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, male, cisgender, etc. So this is, that there's like this hierarchy, right? Critical race praxis. So this is the idea of critical race theory, which is basically applying the idea of systemic racism to almost every single societal issue and interaction and problem, and saying like, this is what's animating everything in society. And if you're not present to the racism and every little bit of everything, then, you are getting it wrong, or you're blind, or you're not sufficiently, woke to the injustices around you. And that's where the term woke originally comes from, actually. It was this idea of critical race theory, which is now critical race praxis. So which is the idea of, hey, let's take this into practice. Let's put it in academia. Let's put it in schools. Let's have everyone basically listen to the voices again of the people that are historically oppressed and relate to them as being historically oppressed, and that all of social interactions come down to oppressor and oppressed. And then the kind of, and I have to kind of define these terms because a lot of people, everybody kind of has a sense of what Christian nationalism is, right? It's the idea that people want a Christian country that, where all the laws and basically give special status to Christian people, right? And everybody else has second tier status. So those are pretty commonly understood, but not everybody knows, what we mean when we say intersectionality or critical race praxis. So, on the left, identitarianism often looks like that kind of, identity politics that says only certain voices count, or at least that certain voices count way more than other voices, or should be listened to or heard more because of historical either being underprivileged or privilege that was given to other voices. So now we need to give, we need to give greater privilege to voices that historically haven't been heard in order to compensate for that. So, but at the end of the day, whether we're talking about white nationalism or whether we're talking about critical race praxis, it's fundamentally the same structure. And this is something that James Lindsay talks a lot about, and I respect James. I've met him in person. I think he's a great guy. But I think he has a hard time conveying what is this sort of woke right and woke left, and what is it that they have in common? And I would say that the answer is that they have identitarianism in common, because fundamentally, that's really what is the essence of this whole conversation. It's the idea of group identity above shared humanity. And that's really the true opposite of cosmopolitanism, which is the point I would make to Brett. So instead of setting up this false dichotomy between cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism, I want to offer a better model, which I call the cosmopolitan identitarian axis. So we're going to look at a grid, which I created for this purpose. Okay, there's the grid. Okay, great. So let's kind of go through the four grids, and then we'll talk more about this whole concept. So top left, you've got your cosmopolitan left. So this is, most people would think of this as like the traditional left. And I think that, frankly, Brett and Heather and, I certainly would identify with this cosmopolitan left. And this is the left where you find ideas like pluralism, specifically the idea of multiculturalism and liberalism, which is very consistent with, for example, Montessori philosophy, universal human rights, and being inclusive. So, great examples of left cosmopolitanism are people like Frederick Douglass, who fought for the inclusion of Black Americans in the American constitutional tradition, George Orwell, who condemned the totalitarianism but retained that universal moral concern, even while critiquing his own society through his fiction. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., especially in his appeal to content of character over color of skin, which emphasized that universal moral worth of the individual. So these are people who are standing for everyone's dignity, not just their particular groups. On the right cosmopolitan side, you have, I think, equally solid ideas. You've got classical liberalism, civic nationalism, so not, ethnic nationalism, but instead the idea that by sort of learning shared values and learning the importance of civics and working together as a society, we're going to have a better, more flourishing society in general. And the idea of religious pluralism, like we can all be under the same umbrella and we can all have our beliefs respected and honored, but not have to establish a particular, church as the official religion of the country. So some famous examples of right cosmopolitans would be Friedrich Hayek, who, of course, defended spontaneous order and warned against collectivism in general. Milton Friedman, who championed individual freedom from, above any kind of group categories, very much a classical liberal. on the right, and Ronald Reagan, of course, who really at his best when he spoke of America as the shining city on a hill, open to all who believed in freedom, not just one culture or creed. So again, the common theme is universal dignity, voluntary association, individual freedom. So now we get into the identitarian, the identitarian ideas and kind of seeing how those are a little bit distinct from the cosmopolitan ideas. So on the left identitarian side, you get in the realm of the woke identity politics, critical race praxis or critical race theory in practice. It's not just critical race theory. I mean, there's critical gender theory and there's other types of critical theory, but we'll just say critical theory in general, and putting that in practice, and a worldview that increasingly centers on power, oppression, and grievance. A lot of people call that neo-Marxism. I think that's reasonable, as the lens through which we have to view all human interactions and interpret everything. So, classic examples of left identitarianism are going to be Robin DiAngelo, who reduces all white people to unconscious racism and treats guilt as a virtue. Right? Ibram X. Kendi, who defines anti-racism as the pursuit of racial discrimination in reverse. So it's like we need to have reverse discrimination, as long as it flips the historical hierarchy. That's a good thing. And then a more traditional example would be like the Nation of Islam, which combines leftist racial grievance with religious and ethnic supremacism. And you see that racial and ethnic supremacism, frankly, on both sides of the identitarian aisle. And all three of those examples share a belief in group guilt, group virtue, and this moral asymmetry based on identity. And then finally, we have in the bottom right here, the white nationalism, so the identitarian right, white nationalism, which is basically white identity politics, Christian nationalism, again, Christian identity politics, and blood and soil style thinking. So that's that, ethno-traditionalism, which is very common in the history of like Eastern Europe and obviously Nazi Germany. So modern examples of that in our culture today, Nick Fuentes, I think, is probably one of the most commonly discussed about examples, who's, his America First rhetoric kind of starts to get into that white ethno-nationalism. And he's comfortable talking about that. Another very well-known example would be Steve Bannon, who talks about Judeo-Christian civilization in like civilizational war terms. And he elevates the West as a radicalized, racialized identity. And then third is a Russian theorist named Alexander Dugin, who is one of Putin's closest advisors, who believes nations really should be built on ethnic and religious identity. And he envisions global conflict between distinct civilizations. He shared all this in a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, if anybody's interested in learning more about Alexander Dugin. And he is seen by many as sort of like the chief architect of modern right identitarian thought. So again, this is really not conservatism. This is tribalism that's sort of dressed up in the clothing of patriotism. One of the things you're going to see on both sides of this is, and as in common with all identitarianism, is cancel culture. So if you think cancel culture is just a woke phenomenon, a woke left phenomenon, you think again. Yes, on the left, you do get Twitter mobs, purity spirals. You're canceled unless you parrot the narrative. Absolutely, we've experienced that personally. On the right, you get litmus tests on religion. You get litmus tests on immigration, or even the 2020 election. Say the wrong thing, you're out. So cosmopolitans, as a rule, are not canceling people for thinking differently. Identitarians do. So that's a big dividing line, big indication of like, if you're canceling people, okay, maybe you need to take a step back and maybe make a U-turn. And I guess I think this is a crucial point, because it bears stating that my goal here is not to cancel identitarians, but to point out that the risk and the danger of identitarian belief, so that as a society, we can listen to people carefully. And when we hear identitarian ideas start to surface, we say, well, maybe I want to down-regulate my listening of that particular individual, or at least when they talk about those issues, I'm going to push back or disagree, or, not just assume that, well, because I agree with them on maybe some other issues, I'm going to agree with everything they have to say, including some of their more identitarian ideas. And I see that a lot right now. It's sort of like, well, I see that a lot right now, I think, especially on the right, which I think is just beginning to grapple with right identitarianism in a way that the left has been dealing with now for quite some time, where you have people that are, historically have been core, honest actors that are loved and beloved by the community, that are starting to express more and more right identitarian views. And it's sort of like, well, I've agreed with this person up until now. I think I should just kind of keep sticking with them out of loyalty and, sort of this parapsychological yeah, friendship that I've developed, not an actual friendship, but just because I listen to them all the time. And there's a tendency to want to accept these ideas wholesale without really analyzing them and saying, well, gee, do I really agree with this? Is this really what I believe? So, at the end of the day, this divide between cosmopolitanism and identitarian does derive from a deeper source, and that is the Enlightenment versus postmodernism. Okay, and this is really where we get into that, postmodern neo-Marxist, which Dr. Peterson likes to talk about all the time. So cosmopolitanism is fundamentally descends from the Enlightenment, and it's the shared Enlightenment values of philosophers like John Locke, Kant, the belief in reason and individual dignity, which really form the foundation of Western democracy and what we call liberal democracy. But basically, traditional liberal ideas all come from this idea of the Enlightenment, that we all have a shared belief in reason and logic and individual dignity. Identitarianism, on the other hand, is rooted in predominantly in its modern form, certainly rooted in postmodernism. Postmodernism, and a lot of it is neo-Marxist fixation on power. So people like Foucault, Derrida, the idea that truth is just a mask for power, so that there is no real truth. And although really what's underneath everything is this quest for power, and power is really all that there is at the end of the day. So the cosmopolitan worldview, which I believe is obviously worth protecting and defending, sees shared truth as possible. And the identitarian only sees narrative. It's like everything is just a story. There is no fundamental truths about reality. It's just all made up, and you can believe whatever you want to believe, and it's no one person is more correct than anyone else. So, where do I see us going from here? What am I advocating in this conversation? So to me, the positive vision that I see is really a post-identitarian pluralism, a return to the values that really founded our country and make our country great. And that way forward is this post-identitarian pluralism. So it's one that really affirms that the left and the right can coexist in one moral community, which they have for our entire country's history, that protects individual rights regardless of what group they're affiliated with. So equal rights for everyone, celebrates cultural richness, multiculturalism, right, in the true original meaning of the word, without moral asymmetry, saying, oh, one group is better than the other, or one group because our ideas, and this is where I think Brett has a valid point, where you have little insular groups that stay with just their people and don't assimilate. It's really out of a sense of like, we're better. And you see that a lot in some of the interviews. If you watch interviews with people who are part of some of these insular groups, that's the way they talk. They're like, we're coming to basically take over because we think our ideas are better, and everyone else should sort of conform to our ideas. And that is fundamentally, in my view, anti-American, and is an example of moral asymmetry, which is to say that because of your ethnicity, or because your religion, or your color of your skin, that you're somehow superior. And I think that is fundamentally destructive to our basic principles of Western democracy. And I think, or democracy in general. And I think that a post-identitarian pluralism would also reject guilt by association and virtue by category. So this idea that, well, because you are a particular skin color or a particular religion, you're guilty, or because, you are a particular skin color or, gender identity or um, sexual orientation, you are virtuous. Really virtue is individual. It's not categorical. It's not identity based. So we need to reclaim that space where disagreement is allowed. And this is, Partovi effect is definitely one of those spaces. Freedom is preserved and dignity is for everyone, not just for us, whatever us means, right? Whatever group us falls into. Um, and, that space, yes, I think at the end of the day, I think Brett is right. That space is cosmopolitanism. And he's right in many ways about that. But I would say that why he's right is sort of not why he thinks he's right. So hopefully I've laid that out and made the case for it. Do you have anything that you wanted to add to it or
I have,
questions or?
so this seems like I get everything that you're saying, but the bone that you have to pick with Brett, is it a war of semantics or
Definitions, I would say.
precision of language?
Precision of language is a big part of it. And I think the reason why that matters is because if we get rid of, so thank you for asking that or bringing that up, because I think the reason why that matters is because if you get rid of multiculturalism in an attempt to rid ourselves of the wokeness, of the identitarianism, we get rid of multiculturalism, then we start to attack some of the actual fundamental pillars of cosmopolitanism that he claims he wants to preserve and nourish and revitalize, because I think that you have to have a fundamental respect for other cultures if you are going to have a true pluralistic, egalitarian, multicultural, again, society. And I think that that is part of the vision of, again, people like Maria Montessori, who, we really value and respect, and we send our children to Montessori school because we value and respect that worldview. And I think that that worldview is, frankly, one of the best things that the left has ever come up with. And I think to say, well, because it's been twisted, and I see that, I see how aspects of it have been twisted by those on the identitarian left. We just have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of multiculturalism, I think would be a grave error. And I think if we root it in its original cosmopolitan foundation, which is a cosmopolitan left foundation of, on the same axis again as traditional liberalism, then you see that, oh, multiculturalism is fine. There's not a problem here. We can all have different cultures. We can respect each other's cultures, learn about each other's cultures. When people are worshiping different, having different faiths, and like for example, there was our now 4-year-old just last week came home with a little cookie, and it was from one of his friends who's of Indian background, East Indian. And it says Happy Diwali. So, and he created a little, is the candle artwork part of that too? So he
Yeah.
created a little candle thing. And, so he's learning about the different cultures, learning about, Diwali, which is East Indian, presumably Hindu festival of lights. So, to me, that is about cultural awareness. It's about cultural competency. It's about understanding that there's different ways of thinking, different beliefs out there. Not that, our belief is the only way and that other people are all inherently wrong, but rather that that there are other ways of viewing reality, other ways of viewing the world, and that um, those are useful and may even teach us something, and that those are all part of like a tapestry, or maybe a quilt would be a good analogy of society. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Does it make sense why it's important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater? Like why we don't want to actually get rid of multiculturalism just to push back on left identitarianism?
Absolutely.
Right.
And
Because
I'm just thinking about how it applies to me and how I grew up
Mm.
and what my um, perception around multiculturalism um, is and like what it looks like on the court and as lived. And I think it was a very positive driving force, like in our community, which is very multicultural.
Hmm.
I mean, our church, there's Latinos and Vietnamese people and um, Eastern European Eastern European people um, and yeah, so my view of it was also always very positive. So that's definitely not something to get rid of. I mean, Brett as a Caucasian man, maybe speaking from a different lens.
Well, I think he's coming from the lens of seeing where the idea of we need to welcome all other cultures has led to a place where we have allowed a new status quo to emerge. And this is where I do think he has a valid critique, which is we've allowed insular groups to form, essentially little and I think historically it hasn't been a big deal, right? Because I think historically, you always had Chinatown, for example, you always had, little Saigon, you always had little Manila, and you still do in a lot of the, cities in California. Um, but I think that's a lot of that is for like first generation people who are just coming here and need to kind of have a place where they feel comfortable. But I think what you see is that over time, the children and especially the grandchildren, like more and more assimilate into the culture where they are and become more cosmopolitan. And yes, they have that root in the, holidays and the food and the traditions of the mother culture, but then they've also adopted and adapted and taken on a lot of the cult, the elements of the common elements of American culture. And I think that's healthy. I think that his concern is that there are perhaps certain subgroups where multiple generations go by and we don't see that same level of assimilation. And I can point to two examples in particular, which I agree with him on, and I think they're concerning. I see it in areas where there's especially high percentage of population of one particular ethnicity, and there's not a push to go out and get educated, for example. And you see that predominantly. And I think those both I think probably both of those things have to be present. First, you have to have a large insular community, and second, you have to have not a strong push to go out and get educated and learn about it's actually an absence of multiculturalism on behalf of some of the immigrants that have come to this country. I think that you see it most predominantly, I would argue, amongst some of the Muslim Arab immigrants to Michigan. You see that in, the Dearborn area where, and I mean, this has been in the news a lot lately. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, I would say, maybe, are you familiar with some
I
of the,
am.
yeah, so maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Before that,
Okay.
I can see now why um, you're you're saying don't throw the baby out with the bath water. Um, I'm getting my thoughts together.
Yeah, while you're getting your thoughts together, I mean, I can touch briefly on some things that I've heard, right? So I heard, for example, um, that as a show of trying to be more inclusive, a lot of the people on the Democrat side voted for some city council members in Dearborn who were Muslim, and that as a result of them having sort of put their faith in this idea of what they thought was pluralism, right? And giving a Muslim majority to the city council, they now have banned the display of the pride flag, right? Which is sort of, frankly, very consistent with Muslim ideas. But the question is, do we want to have a society that is founded on a particular religion's ideas, or do we want to have a society that is founded on religious tolerance and acceptance, and even the woke religion, even to me, the idea that these I don't think we should demonize people who are identitarian left or identitarian right. I mean, we have a tendency to, but I would just say that I prefer we say, well, that's not really the direction we want to go, you know? And as an American society, we know better. And it gets back to, you know, this idea of there's things that maybe we can't do because it's against the law, maybe things we shouldn't do because it's not in our best interest, and maybe things we mustn't do because to do so undermines the fabric of our society. And I think that that's a lot of what we're faced with here.
So what I'm hearing is that there's nothing inherently insidious about multiculturalism. It's almost as if there's some kind of other presence, like other entity disrupting um, the peace.
Well, they're using some of the mechanisms by which multiculturalism has sort of served our society and saying, well, gee, I can take advantage of that. They're gaming the system, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's what Brett is responding to. And I think that that's a valid concern. But I think that the way that they're gaming it is through a fundamentally identitarian lens. I think that you see in that example from Dearborn, where it's like, well, now that we have been able to game the system through multiculturalism, we're now going to bring our identitarian, Muslim, Arab ideology to the fore and basically say, well, no more pride flags, right? And look, I mean, you can believe whatever you want to believe about the pride flags, and maybe it's not what you would put in front of your house. But again, I would say, well, but how would you like it if somebody told you that you can't fly the flag that you believe in front of your house, right? Which is a problem going on right now in the UK, where the St. George flag, which is the traditional flag of England, is being taken down, or people are being, told that they can't fly the flag because, oh, it's a sign of what, of ethno-nationalism or something, right? But it's on the other side, right? So the question is, it's like, do we really want to say that you can't do these things? I would say no. But I would say, do we want to say that you're highly discouraged or maybe that you mustn't do these things? I think that's a valid point, And I think that's how that's how the correct way to police it. The correct way to police it is not to say, oh, well, we have to ban multiculturalism or we have to ban identitarianism even. I think that they tried to ban the Nazi party in Germany, and all it did was make them stronger. They arrested Hitler and they imprisoned him for I think over a year. And all it did was make him stronger. There's a saying we have in the personal development work we've done through Landmark, which is that which you resist persists. And I think we're seeing a lot of that resistance coming from both sides of the identitarian aisle right now. And I think it's just making both of those identitarian sides stronger and creating more division and more canceling, trying to cancel each other.
Yeah, so I will speak to, I will posit a question. Uh, where else is it cropping up besides Dearborn?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we see that also in England, the same issue with a lot of the predominantly, I think, Muslim Arab population there, although there's also some comments I've heard about the, Muslim Pakistani group there as well. So, but it's predominantly you see that in the you see that in a lot of the insular communities that are created around Islam because there's like a separate and we have a lot of beautiful Muslim people in our, orbit, and we have a lot of um, beautiful Muslim people in our neighborhood, frankly, and where the level of assimilation has been extremely high, and so there's no issue. And I think that's really what I'm pointing to here. I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm trying to say, look, if the level of assimilation is low, you're going to have problems. So I'll give you another example that's got nothing to do with Arabs or Muslims. So there was a guy who used to mow our yard when I was a kid, And then at some point, who's Hispanic, I forget exactly from what country, somewhere in Latin America, Hispano America. Um, and, when his son got to be a certain age, his son joined him, again, mowing yards. And there's nothing wrong with mowing yards. But I would just say that I remember I was always struck by that. I was like, interesting, like that his son basically, and his son spoke some English, right? But it was like a very slow progression of generation to generation, which is not typical in my experience in that community. I would say typically in the Hispanic community, you see a more rapid assimilation. But my concern was maybe there's certain pockets that I don't know about where that's not happening or not happening as quickly as I'd like it to see, because this is the son who had access to the U.S. educational system, had access to not all the same things I had growing up, but some of the same things I had growing up and that you had growing up. And yet, was still kind of following in his dad's footsteps, doing, the mowing. And again, nothing wrong with mowing, but I would just say that it struck me as kind of like interesting and a little bit odd. And I must have been maybe in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s when I noticed this. But I was like, interesting that he wasn't able to kind of break out and do something and really, because I've seen so many. Of people doing that.
Mhm.
So I wonder if there's like a certain maybe critical mass of insularity that happens where people get fixated on their identity, whether it be, Hispanic, whether it be a particular country in this, whether it be Mexican or Colombian or Peruvian or whatever, whether it be, again, with Islam, whether it be, I mean, there's some of that even. I would say the thing is, one of the things I've noticed about Persian culture, which, I'm half Persian on my dad's side from, uh, he was originally born in Iran. And I would say that he's now an American citizen, has been for many decades. But the point is, in fact, he hates being called Iranian American. He'd say, call me an American. That's what I am. So he's a big believer in cosmopolitanism. That's absolutely like, like he lives and breathes. So I grew up with a father who was like 100% dedicated to cosmopolitan worldview. But I also really enjoyed the like expression of Persian culture that I got to have through that side of my family. And it was very enriching for me growing up. And I felt like it's created, it's become part of who I am on like just a very organic level. But one of the things I will say about Persians, and this is not me patting myself on my back, it's really just something I've noticed, is that the Persian immigrants that I have met have been very committed, not only to their Persian culture, but like go out, get educated, assimilate, become part of the society, you know, get as much education as possible. So it's like, it's both of those. It's like, yes, you must sort of adhere to the Persian cultural norms that we think are the most important, which are mostly around social events and food and sometimes religious observance, depending on how religious your family is. But my family was not super religious growing up. Um, and um, the other half, which is the education piece and going out in the world and making a name for yourself and doing all the things that you're capable of. And I think that both of those are crucial. And I think that what I see is missing amongst some of the cultures, the cultural groups that I think Brett is reacting to is that second part, which is go out, experience other cultures, get educated, you know. Does that make sense, or does that kind of
It
resonate?
does. I'm thinking about Amish people. Like, what about them?
Right. Well, they obviously are kind of yeah, that's such a great question. Because so they're insular by design, right? And yet they give their children the choice when they turn 18. But obviously, if they do choose to leave, they're leaving their whole family. So that's really a tough choice. It's not like they're making it easy on them, because it's not like, oh, you go back and you can come and then you can come back for Christmas. It's not like that. So it probably doesn't occur as a choice to very many Amish youth, you know. Um, but I would say that What's super interesting about that point is that the Amish are really growing as an electorate. In fact, some people feel that it was the Amish vote that actually got Trump elected because of the Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of Pennsylvania Amish. And so the thought is that that vote was able to swing the Pennsylvania, by a percentage or two, and that won Pennsylvania for Trump, which, arguably won the whole election, although he won all the other swing states too. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's such a good point because that is they're one of the most rapidly growing ethnic groups in this country. And I forget who this was, but I heard somebody say something like, you know, 200 years in the future, this country is going to look a lot more Amish than anything else if the current reproduction trends continue, right? And I think that that is really fascinating to think about. And yeah, I mean, I would say that the Amish are absolutely identitarian and absolutely, identitarian right. And so that brings up a really good point of like, if everybody else decides to stop having kids and the Amish keep doing what they're doing, then yeah, that's the direction we're likely to head as a country unless there's some major changes. So we have to keep that in mind too when people are like, oh, I don't want to have kids, or oh, I only want to have one or two. It's like, well, what kind of future do you want those kids to have? You know?
I will also add that um, I know that fertility uh, is very much optimized, in Amish communities versus because of their natural living and the food that they consume. And
Yeah, there's a lot we can learn from Amish, right? Yeah, I'm not saying the Amish are bad or even mostly bad. I'm just saying that
just saying that they're going to have no problems having more kids.
they're gonna have no problem having more kids, and the rest of society, obviously. And some people would say, oh, well, that's just natural selection, that's just evolution. I'd love to hear Brett's comments on this, but that's just the process working its way out, and the survival of the fittest, so to speak. But he doesn't love that particular. He doesn't like everything's getting reduced to that, I think. But it does make one wonder. I think it's an interesting point.
I'm also thinking about the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, if anybody's ever been to a yellow deli or consumed yerba mate, that's like they're such a huge entrepreneurial conglomeration. It's very much I think I would say similar, to the Amish people.
So just to be clear, when you say 12 tribes of Israel, you're not talking about the original 12 tribes of Israel from Israel. You're talking about the modern revival in this country. It's like a sort of messianic Jewish
Mhm.
communal living.
Yes.
Just talk a little bit about it.
Uh, well, they're they're everywhere. They're in Vista,
Hmm.
Vista, California.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know about everywhere, but they're growing.
yes,
Sure.
they're growing.
Sure.
Yes. So thank you for checking my precision of language. And I think it's also another community, identitarian community um, that's rapidly growing.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So really, I mean, it's not that I would say, again, that which you resist persists. So I would be careful to say, oh, we need to combat identitarianism, right? We need to resist identitarianism. It's like, no, we need to offer a vision of the future, which is consistent with our values of pluralism, egalitarianism, and yes, cosmopolitan multiculturalism.
Because where's the dividing line or the fine line, where identitarianism becomes exclusion and it becomes um, just this monster of judgment, and like there's a shield wall and there's no openness.
Well, not only just judgment, but I would say judgment taken to the extreme,
Right.
which is discrimination, which is racism,
Actions of,
which
yeah.
is religious intolerance. We see it in the form of um, I don't like to use the term anti-Semitism because it's not precise. It's because, technically Arabs are also Semitic. And so I always say anti-Judaism. I feel like we're seeing that in the rise of, anti-Judaism and, people's opposition to a lot of the, um, or frankly, a lot of smearing of Jewish people that's been going on more and more. There's been a revival of that. You see, there are some, I would say, legitimate and illegitimate concerns about Islam and how it is seen in society. And I think that same is true of Christianity. Same is true of, probably most of the world's religions. Um, and I think that, speaking of which, well, no, I'm not going to say anything about that, but more to come on the topic of religion from me in particular, but not in this episode.
How different is it that identitarianism with an agenda? I mean, you have these demographics of people popping up, right? How different is that than, let's say, uh, Chinese identitarianism being flooded through the internet?
So you're talking about in China?
No, I mean TikTok and how it's being infiltrated, how people are being how the minds of people in the USA are being uh influenced.
So you're talking about how the minds of people in the USA are being influenced via social media and algorithms coming from China?
Hmm.
Well, there was the whole recent um, Twitter, or no, not Twitter, TikTok sort of settlement that they reached, where basically um, I think it's what, ByteDance, is that the name of the Chinese company that's they're gonna retain some minority ownership of it, but the United States investors are gonna get the majority of it so that it becomes a United States company. Um, which is good. I mean, I think it needs to be a United States company that's under United States control if it's going to be essentially propagandizing our people, because we have laws about propagandizing our own people, which are not always adhered to, but we do have them. Um, and there's actually a movement to strengthen those laws right now, which personally in favor of. Um, and I forget, do you remember the name of the law that was modified, I think, under the Obama administration, that historically was like a flat prohibition against propagandizing our own people, and they claimed that it was being modernized. Do you remember what that was? Yeah, I mean, we could look it up, but basically, I'm curious to look it up actually, just so we can. Yeah, so that's the Smith-Mundt Act, and the Smith-Mundt Act basically said, well, it's okay to propagandize other countries, but you can't propagandize our own country. And it was essentially telling the federal government that. And that was apparently rolled back during Obama, and now we're wanting to restore that, and I think that that's a good idea. Um, but yeah, I think specifically, I'm trying to position what your question was in this larger framework of this conversation. Um, I don't know whether I see propagandizing as inherently identitarian. I think it can be. Oh, I think I see maybe an angle in what you're saying,
Yeah.
which is that perhaps China, through social media, specifically TikTok, has been stirring up and stoking up this identitarian worldview, perhaps both on the right and the left, as a way to divide Americans.
Mhm.
Right. That's what you're getting at. Okay. So I agree with that. And I think this is one of the biggest problems in this whole conversation is that Identitarianism divides people by definition, right? Because we don't all have the same identities. We have differing identities. Whereas cosmopolitanism unites people. So the degree to which our media focuses on identity is the degree to which we are then divided as a species, as a society. The degree to which we focus on cosmopolitanism and our shared humanity, the easier it is for society to have a shared vision and shared values and work together. So I think,
I guess what I'm saying with because I know that you're talking about groups of people that are actually, on U.S. soil, and imagine if that kind of presence, like that kind of Chinese presence, were here, like actually physically here, and building large communities, that,
oh, that's another layer. So you're
yeah.
you're talking about like Chinese immigrants
Mhm.
that are forming communities, kind of like we talked about with the Arab Muslims in Dearborn, that are, forming those communities potentially to have like a Chinese ethno-nationalist identity. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that that's something that actually is so interesting. If you go back and watch that full interview that Brett does with Dr. Peterson, um, he part of what he's sharing is his trip down to the Darien Gap. And one of the things he talks about is that these are people that were coming across the border. This is before Trump closed the border. Um, there were there was a camp. There were two separate camps, and Brett gets into all of this in this conversation, where he says in one camp it was a bunch of different cultures, mostly Spanish speaking, and everyone was basically trying to flee from difficult conditions and come to have a better life. And then there was a second camp that was like all Chinese and all like young Chinese men, and that were also trying to get in the United States. And that apparently when you went to talk with them, they wouldn't talk to you. They wouldn't tell you why they were there or what they were doing. And they wouldn't really let people interview them. And I think when he was talking about how, I think it was either a guide or a friend that he was with was able to understand Mandarin and was able to overhear them. And, when he kind of called them out in their own language, they got upset and basically kicked him out of the camp. So I may be misremembering that slightly, but that's vaguely what I remember. And then the concern was, well, what are these young Chinese men doing when they get to this country? And I think that's a very valid question, because we have a lot of vulnerable infrastructure in this country, especially to internal sabotage, and not just physical infrastructure, but also, I would argue, mental, emotional, spiritual infrastructure that is also vulnerable to sabotage, as we saw during COVID.
What do you think is the contributing factor to the rise
Well,
of?
just one more thing before you ask me that
Okay.
question. I think that it's important to note that when you have, and gets back to Sun Tzu, the Sun Tzu, most people call him, the correct pronunciation is Sun Tzu. But it gets back to the idea that if you have an overwhelming adversary that you cannot defeat militarily, which China's not going to defeat us militarily, the best way you can defeat them is if you can get them to start attacking themselves and have them defeat themselves from within. And I think that's a big part of what we're seeing with regard vis-a-vis China today. But go ahead.
What do you think is the contributing factor to the rise of identitarianism with an agenda specifically targeted towards the US?
Well, I think that what I just said is actually the answer to your question. I think it's because they want to undermine our society, because they know that the only way they can possibly defeat us is if we are basically eating each other. If we're at each other's throats, if we have some civil war and, half the country gets wiped out, or, our borders become vulnerable as a result, then we will no longer be the number one country in the world. We we will expend our resources. I mean, this is what Rome did. Why do you think Rome fell? If you study the Roman Empire, you know this. Rome fell because it failed to deal with the issue of succession effectively. That's the fundamental reason. All the other reasons are like, okay, but tangential. But there was not a method by which, a clear method by which one emperor succeeded another Roman emperor through time. And so you often had civil war every time an emperor died. And that is not sustainable, right? So civil war is fundamentally what destroys empires, the truly great empires. And realistically, that's probably what will get us in the end of the day if we're not careful. So I think that that's their goal. Their goal is to destroy the American empire, and their goal is to do it within, because they know that's their only chance. Excuse me. And that's essentially, by the way, it's not like we as a country are not to some degree aware of that. That was the Biden administration's whole rationale for getting embroiled in this whole Ukraine-Russia debacle, is the idea that we're going to weaken them. We're going to weaken Russia by having them embroiled in this forever war with Ukraine. And I think that to some degree that has worked. But my question to the Biden administration people would be, well, then what? Right? You want China to conquer Siberia? Is that your goal? Is that healthy for the long-term health of, well, not only Russia but also Europe, and therefore, our allies? So I think sometimes people, even in policy circles, are thinking, one or two steps ahead and not necessarily 7 steps ahead, which is really what you have to be thinking if you're thinking about, world affairs and what's likely to be the downstream consequences of your actions. And I think if you study history, that becomes easier, by the way. I think that the biggest problem in politics is that people do not study enough history. And as somebody who was a history major in undergrad, I love history and I keep studying history. I mean, it's one of my sort of hobbies in a way, is to study history. The best way to be able to understand what's coming is to understand, where we've been, what's happened before, and what are the cycles that repeat over time that show us what is likely to happen again. Not guaranteed, but what's likely.
Beautifully said. And I also, there may be a little bit of mystery to what I'm inviting our audience to take a look at, but also just take that and also take it, apply it internally, like to your life, personally and internally to your life.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the same idea I have about environmentalism, right? If you start thinking, I always say start with reading labels and thinking about what you're putting in your body, because the moment you do that, you're going to start realizing that when you put things in the garbage can or pour things down the drain or throw things outside, that eventually that comes back into your body, right? It's all part of what you yourself are getting exposed to and your own health. So to be an environmentalist is really just to be somebody who cares about their own health. And if you tell me, well, I'm really a healthcare fanatic, but F the environment, I'm like, well, you're not quite there yet, because you have to think about how all these things are interconnected. And the interconnectedness of all life is fundamental to Montessori education. We've talked about that a lot today, just in passing, but it's, one of the core principles that we believe in and are something that we teach our children. And I think that, it's one of the reasons why I advocate for Montessori education. And, for those who don't have a good Montessori school around them, Montessori homeschool. In fact, we should actually probably interview the Montessori homeschool lady. That would be a good conversation.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
I was gonna say that was a very thoughtful, um, on the court, like example of real example living of my invitation,
Yeah.
like that you took on, like right then.
Yeah. Well, because I do think that history is absolutely, you know, So it's two things. History can inform the present, but also understanding that because history is often what's driving the present, it also knowing that allows us to get that history out of the future that we're living into and put it back in the past where it belongs so that we can truly create a future, that's where anything is possible. Which
Yes.
is another thing that we believe is possible, but it's not possible if you're not able to know and identify your history that's actually driving you and that actually is giving you who you're being in the present. Because
Yes.
it's not your present, it's not your past is not giving you who you are in the present, right? It's actually the past that's in your future that is, oh, that's going to happen again because it happened to me yesterday. That's driving your behavior today in the present. So do you want to talk more about that or?
I'll give you an example. I'll give an example so it really communicates to
Yeah, so it
people.
lands. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, in third grade, I had a crush on Nathan Esterline. He was a blonde-haired, brown-eyed kid. So I wrote a note like, I like you. Do you like me? Yes. No.
Very cute.
And then the friends passed it to him, and he looked at it and picked his nose and put a booger in it and crumpled it up.
Hmm.
Was I
Sassy.
was I ever going to express, that I liked a boy again? No.
Yeah.
So,
That's so funny.
but
I had a similar experience.
hold on.
That's so funny.
So that was my Nathan Esterline experience, right? This deck of cards.
Hmm.
And then, something else happened. I got there in when first day of kindergarten. I had a bowl cut and I was dressed like a little boy, and I had these couple older kids staring at me, and I overheard them say, "Is that a girl or a boy? She must be a girl because look, she has earrings." Okay, so boom, right there. What did it make that mean? Oh my gosh, people can't tell whether I'm a boy or a girl. So and then more experiences accumulated that had me just, oh my gosh, you know, I'm just I'm weird. I'm weird. I'm dumb. People think I'm dumb. Um, and then also in grade school, I spoke perfect English. My teachers didn't know because they judged me as quiet, so they put me in English as a second language with one other brown, Asian kid. So I was excluded from people. So you know, here's that baggage. And then my boyfriend in grade school, Danny Alvarado of like 3 days, called me on the phone and said, I don't think we should be boyfriend and girlfriend anymore. Okay. Like, what did I do? I did something wrong. So here's all of that, right? And you come to a point in your life where you have all these blind spots revealed to you through whether it be personal development work, inner work, some people call it shadow work. And they say, oh, I made up a huge story about myself that I wasn't lovable. Oh my gosh, I made such a huge story up that I was weird. I made such a huge story up about myself that I can't really be feminine, because I look like a boy. Oh my gosh, I made up a story that, I can't really tell a man what I really, really want because he'll be reject me. Not down. I made a story that my mom called me a name, so she doesn't love me. I don't have any value as a woman. I made that up and pushed her away for like 17 years of my life. I can put that away. I, just all the stuff that I made up. And so when I let go of all of that stuff, who am I? Nothing in the past. Like I have a clear slate upon which to create anything within the rules of God. So here I am. I am vulnerable. I am authentic. I am fully self-expressed. And that is what I am from each moment, now and now and now and now. And that is what I choose to because I have full informed consent about my life and it's not run by all that stuff. And that's what I choose to impart in my daily life when I'm with people and when I'm with you and when I'm with our sons.
And we're blessed by it.
And imagine if everybody had that opportunity to do that kind of work, to really look internally and to, clear the slate of and take full self-responsibility. They would really arrive at their basic goodness. And I think the world would look very different.
Well, I think that that's actually a very multicultural, egalitarian, pluralistic view that we all have a basic goodness. And I think that that is certainly what I believe is possible for humanity. And I think that if we live into that future and if we work toward that future, then we can absolutely get there.
Yeah.
Where that is able to take flourish, where it's able to take root and flourish. Um, you know, I think that's possible. I mean, there's countervailing theories, which if you follow Dr. Jordan Peterson, his take on that is that maybe that's possible for like 97 to 99% of people, but you're always going to have 1 to 3% that are kind of incorrigible psychopaths. But, I don't know. I wonder in my own mind if someone had really loved those people as babies and cared for them and also provided them with strong limits from a very early age, but lots of love and lots of control, authoritative parenting, which we know is what works the best from all the research. um if that might not have shifted the needle for them. I mean, I feel like, and also with optimal nutrition and all the other things, like I think that I just think that we have maybe some genetic predispositions, but I don't ever think genetics is destiny. I don't think that the blueprint dictates the individual. I think that the the blueprint provides a framework, and then all the environmental exposures and experiences and um, really give us who we become.
Yeah. I mean, one single deck alone, about expressing what it is that I uh wanted for my life. You remember I stood up in that room and then I said, my name is Maddie and I want to get married and have kids. Like simple as that. Whereas I would not have ever said that in a public setting.
Right.
Yeah. And then you were in that room.
I was, yeah. I took note. I was like, okay, I can help you with that.
And then as we got to know each other, I provided you a list of, I think, at least 20 things and of what I really desired in a relationship. And you told me that there's nothing on this list um, that I can't, I don't, there is nothing on this list.
That I'm not willing to be cause in the matter of,
Yes.
which is a way of saying be responsible for. Yeah. So anyway, that's mostly been true.
Largely been true.
Largely
Yes.
been true. Um, but yeah, I mean, and I would say that's really good advice, actually, for women to provide that kind of information to a man up front. I would say maybe by around the third to fifth date would be good, because that way a guy can really see, like, do I see myself in this list, or am I like, no way am I gonna want to fulfill on this list?
You're,
I would not, on the other hand, recommend that any man give such a list to a woman within the first few dates. That's something that I waited to give her my list literally on the day that I proposed. And it was, I think, 5 or 6 things. And basically, it was inside the context of you're already all these things. And I just want to make sure you continue to generate all of these things. And it's inside of that request that I'm putting a ring on your finger.
so I think we're bleeding into our, our a possible relationship episode. And
It's coming
yes.
sooner or later.
Yes. Hmm.
Anything else for today, though?
No, I'm complete. And I did want to acknowledge you for engaging me in a conversation that I would usually avoid. The whole the politics and the um there's a certain uncomfortability that I have with it, and so thank you for providing that space where um I could spontaneously contribute and explore the questions for myself and really take a look at how this affects not only um, our nation, um, our community, but also our family.
And our family's future,
Yes.
absolutely. And all of the families in the country's future, presumably. So yeah, great. Thanks for engaging with it. Even
Yes.
even though you had like an initial, I don't know about this.
Yeah. My name is Mrs. Madi Partovi.
And I'm Dr. Ryan Partovi. And thank you for joining us on today's episode of The Partovi Effect. Till next time, be well.